morning. Welcome to the last panel of the conference. This panel will be looking at the role of regional and international actors, many of them who are involved in a number of conflicts, often under the guise of peace, but also often acting as spoilers. We'll be looking specifically on how they add fuel to the fire. Today we have a group of distinguished panelists, and I'll introduce them quickly. The first is Carsten Wieland. He's the senior advisor to the UN Special Envoy for Syria. Secondly is Adnan Tabatabai. He's the CEO of the Center for Applied Research in partnership with the Orient. Galip Dalay, a non-resident fellow at Brookings Doha Center and the research director of Shark Forum. And Sebastian, the senior researcher, Center for Applied Research in partnership with the Orient and associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. This panel will consist of 5-minute remarks from each of our panelists, focusing firstly on setting the scene before we dive a little bit deeper into the role of each country, including Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. And let's begin. Thank you. Carsten Wieland, can you help us set the scene?
Thank you very much. We were asked to be brief, so I will only talk about 3 headlines, or 3 theses, in fact, setting out the scene to discuss the role of the regional actors, and in fact it also shows the complicated situation in which the peace efforts are ongoing in Syria. First is the mutation of the conflict, second is the fragmentation, and the third is the bilateralization. And all these are challenges that we are facing. So the mutation of the conflict, just contrasted with something like Colombia, where you had a civil war for 50 years that started out with the social question and land reform. And it was precisely land reform that ended up in the peace agreement 50 years later. Now look at Syria. We have 8 years of war. Do we have anything resembling the initial scene that set out the conflict? Not really. We have had the major overarching conflict of regime against population that has been dimming into the background. We have a range of sub-conflicts that have emerged that have to do partly with regional actors, but partly with the Syrian scene itself. We have Kurdish, intra-Kurdish, Arab-Kurdish. We have regional Saudi Arabia, Iran. We have US-Russia as an international conflict that plays out in Syria. The Security Council is paralyzed because of that. So we have a bunch of different conflicts that have nothing to do with the original start of the conflict in Syria. And that makes it very difficult to work on that. Second, we have the fragmentation that plays a little bit into the first one. We have the fragmentation of Syrian territory. So the question is, where does any peace agreement apply, if it ever happens? We had this dream of a big solution. I started out working in this job with the Lakhdar Brahimi in 2014, and when we were deciding or talking about the decision to end the talks or to continue the talks, I said, whatever we do, we have good arguments, but we should be aware that this will be probably the last time that we speak about Syria as a whole. And only 3 months later, it was Daesh entering the scene, entering Syrian territory to a vast extent, and a player that was absolutely out of or beyond any peace arrangement or actors that you could talk to. Now we have not only the fragmentation of territory, we have the fragmentation of the international support geography of this crisis. You remember in 2015, it was the ISSG, the International Syria Support Group, that was founded. It still exists in some way. I mean, nominally it exists. It has 2 little branches still living a little bit in Geneva, the task forces, the humanitarian task force and the ceasefire task force. But otherwise, the ISSG is defunct, to be honest. Now, what we are facing is a fragmentation. We have the Astana group here. We have the small group there. We have the one or the other kind of bridging effort. And we have the fragmentation of venues and arenas for this political process. Astana, Sochi, Geneva. Or better, the other way around, Geneva, Astana, Sochi. or whatever. So it is a difficult situation. Where are the things negotiated? Detainees are more in Astana, etc. So the third challenge is the bilateralization. We have seen a lot of U-turns and changes of alliances throughout these 8 years. Remember Turkey and its stance versus the Syrian regime. Saudi Arabia, suddenly the king visited Moscow. And you had so many surprises. Surprises are good for a stalled situation, stalled conflict. Actually can create some new dynamics. But it can also create insecurity and the question of how do we really engage the regional partners and the international ones. So the bilateralization today that we are facing it's actually something that is not Syria related. It's something that is the trend, of course, in international relations. You have Turkey, Iran, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Russia, Israel, US, Russia. But who is really interested in a multilateral, all-comprising peace effort and political process? Mostly, when you look at these arenas in the small group, in the Astana meetings, most of the topics are other topics than the political process nowadays. It's about Idlib, it's about the Northeast, it's about pipelines, it's about geopolitics, it's about even more. So these are the three challenges I would like to set out at the beginning, and I promise to be short, and the rest I hope we will be able to discuss later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let's turn to Adnan, who will give us an overview of Iran's regional approaches.
Thank you very much, and I really want to thank the organizers of this conference for having me here. My idea is to briefly say a few words on what I believe drives Iran's regional policies in the Middle East, and obviously I will throw out some meatballs that we can then collectively chew on afterwards. And to really take the theme of this conference in mind, I will try to end on how I believe one can try to engage Iran to seek unity rather than division in the region. Now, what I think is important to note is that Iran's regional policies are determined by the extent to which Iran feels threatened as a country, as a political system, in its territory and its political order. And the threats that Iran's security apparatus senses the most are obviously the US presence in the region, US policies towards Iran, be it sanctions, be it regime change. Obviously, as a second big threat, US allies in the region, primarily Israel, but more increasingly in the past months and 1 or 2 years, Saudi Arabia and also the United Arab Emirates. And Iran does also feel, particularly in its border areas, threatened by extremist groups from different colors and obviously Daesh in the past years. Bearing these threats in mind, what is really a key characterization that we need to understand is that Iranian security decision makers are fully aware of Iran's military inferiority and also its strategic loneliness. Strategic loneliness means that unlike Iran's neighbors, there is not one single protecting power that would come to Iran's help if it ever was attacked. The experience Iran had was quite the opposite when Saddam Hussein attacked Iran in 1980. So there is no big protecting power behind Iran, and as a spoiler, no, Russia is not a protecting power of Iran. And military inferiority is the fact that Iran has been under an arms embargo since basically the foundation of the Islamic Republic, and knows that compared to the US, obviously, Israel, but also compared to the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, even Qatar and Kuwait, Iran's military industry is really inferior. And this is the reason why the security apparatus has felt the need to develop means of deterrence and means of asymmetric warfare. Means of deterrence are primarily the missiles. Iran's missile program is designed as something which is scary enough for the enemy to keep their efforts to curb Iran's regional policies. And means of asymmetric warfare are relations and alignments Iran has with different armed groups in the region, state and non-state allies in the region. My argument, and we can unpack that later, is that these policies are defensive in nature, but on the ground, they obviously create some sort of expansion. So if you have, as Iran, a force that outside your territory is there to deter the enemy, you may do that for defensive purposes, but others perceive that as expansion on the ground. Now, in the interest of time, I just very briefly want to speak about how that can be changed in the future. And again, a spoiler, not by what we see today. So the current US administration policies are obviously exactly the fuel into the engine of Iran's regional policies as we know it in the past years. If, for example, Iran's missile program was supposed to be put on the table, this can only be done because it's a matter of conventional arms control then. This can only be done if it has a comprehensive approach. If Iran is supposed to, for example, scale down the range of its missiles, then other countries in the region would have to do the same. And obviously, Israel would have to give up its nuclear weapons. And you all know how difficult that might end up being. But also countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE would have to scale down the range of their missiles as well. Working with militias or proxies is something that Iran is accused of, but obviously Iran is not the only actor doing it. So this would need, again, a comprehensive approach to that includes all regional actors as to how can states in the region be strengthened. We discussed the weakness and strength of states yesterday. How can states be strengthened such that no more militant groups are used? And obviously Iran is part of it. Iran can help to integrate the Hashtag in Iraq into the state apparatus. Iran can help to a much lower extent to turn the Houthis into an only political actor and no longer a military actor. These are just two examples we can unpack later. And in order to seek unity rather than division in the region, I really need this sort of comprehensive approach. It's absolutely necessary. It will lead only to hell if we continue exceptionalizing one country, in that case Iran. And yeah, let's continue that discussion after our input.
Thank you. Let's turn to Galip now to discuss a bit about the role of Turkey.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for organizers for inviting us to Beirut. Let me first, before focus on Turkey, just first deal with two normative assumptions that we had, particularly in relation to the Syrian crisis, which I believe that proved to be completely wrong. Is one of them, we believe that there was no military solution to the Syrian crisis, and now we know that there was no distinction between military and political solution, and unfortunately there was a military solution to the Syrian crisis. And secondly, we for long we discussed that basically there was the Syrian, this was a Syrian crisis, but then we realized once again it was not a Syrian crisis. The Syrian was the last one to talk about the future of Syria. It was the regional and the international powers that charted the focus, the future of the Syria, and this panel in itself tells us, who mattered in the context of these regional issues as well too. So but how the nature of Turkish foreign policy or regional policy changed within the context of particularly in the Middle East? I think 4 or 5 points is particularly important since the onset of the Arab uprisings. The first one, the scale of Turkish foreign policy, Turkish regional policy dramatically changed. In the beginning of the Arab uprisings, Turkey had a very ambitious and very expansionist regional policy, which basically Syria was one of the microcosm of this policy. The idea was that Turkey should shape the domestic political order in Syria, which was supposed to be a precursor to shaping the emerging regional order in the region, but unfortunately that proved to be not the case, and as a result of it, Turkey increasingly downsized its foreign policy. It went from the region-wide scale to more and more, a scale which ran from northern Iraq to northern Syria, and within which it only grappled with the Kurdish issue. So the scale of it has changed. And the nature of it has changed. At the beginning of the Arab uprisings, the nature of Turkish foreign policy was basically apply what it has learned from its engagement with Europe. I mean, in 2009, 10, 11, the talk in town in Ankara was mostly about the free trade agreements. Turkey signed free trade agreements with countries like Jordan, I think with Lebanon as well too, if I'm not mistaken. But then increasingly in recent years, it went from these soft power tools to more and more hard power tools, like working with the militia, be on the ground militarily. So the nature of engagement also changed as well too. Now Turkey is engaging in an experience that previously it did not have, working with militia and operating within the conflictual context with your own military on the ground and the militia on the side as well, together as well too. The nature of alliance structure of Turkey has changed during this time. Once again, at the outset of Arab uprising, Turkey was strongly working with the West and the Gulf mostly, mostly with the West and the Gulf, and thought that this was one camp, and this camp was situated vis-a-vis Russia and Iran. Now, within the framework of Astana process, Turkey has reshuffled, or at least reconsidered this regional and alliance structure within which it was operating as well too. And the goal of this policy has changed. The goal is no longer the regime change in Syria, no longer the shaping of a new regional order, but it's basically to not allow the Kurdish agency or the Kurdish political actors has more prominence in the region. So the change has gone from the regional order to basically something which is an extension of Turkish domestic politics. It's dealing with the Kurdish issue in a different context. And you clearly see this in recent discussion that is Turkey engaging with the US and Russia as well too. In any engagement between Turkey and Russia and Turkey and the US, the defining factor in recent years in the Middle East has been how these respective actors are approaching the Kurdish issue. That has been the major. And particularly in Turkey's Russia engagement, the invisible third party has always been the US. But why the US? And the US is what is the US approach to the Kurdish issue? What is the Russian approach to the Kurdish issue? It was the Russia that basically gave the green light for Turkey to undertake two military operations in west of the Euphrates with the Afrin operation, with the Euphrates Shields operation and Afrin operation. As a result of it, that Turkey has right now a major enclave in Syria. And now it is the nature of discussion between Turkey and the US on the east of Euphrates as well too. You see this particularly on the discussion of safe zone. When we say safe zone, each actor means different things. When Turkey means safe zone, the safe zone for Turkey is a mean in the fight against the YPG, PYD, SDF. So Turkey sees the safe zone as a step to be taken in the direction of further pushing back the YPG, PYD. For the US, the safe zone is more or less like a buffer zone that needs to be established between its two allies, the Kurds and Turkey, in a sense like a buffer zone that will make sure that the US two allies is not conflicting. So creating some kind of modus vivendi between Turkey and the Syrian Kurds. For Russia, it seems like when they talk about safe zone, they simply means the border security. It's neither safe zone nor buffer zone because the Adnan agreement that Russia is focusing on means border security. It does not talk about the safe zone. And here, once again, the defining issue that shapes the Turkey's behavior towards the safe zone or buffer zone or border security is more or less the Kurdish issue. So unfortunately, once Turkey's Kurdish issue was an extension of its regional policy, but now it seems that Turkey's regional policy is becoming an extension of its Kurdish issue.
Thank you, Galip. Can we now turn to Sebastian, who will give us a little more understanding about the role of Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the organizers to inviting me here to Beirut. When we talk and when we discuss the role of Saudi Arabia in the region, it is mostly explained as an interventionist, as an assertive regional policy approach. And I think to some extent this is true. But we also have to take into consideration what domestic politics, which role does domestic politics play for the regional foreign policy approach of Saudi Arabia. And this is the point I would like to make in my remarks. So what we see under the current leadership of the de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, is to preserving traditional interests by following new approaches. So this is the approach of MBS, and those traditional interests he would like to continue are safeguarding the political survival of the royal family, safeguarding the economic power of Saudi Arabia, and last but not least, safeguarding the power as a regional player. And all of those interests has become under severe pressure in recent years, and therefore Saudi Arabia has to deal with a new situation. After 2011, I would say, when traditional players, regional players such as Egypt or Syria fall into chaos, Saudi Arabia has become the most important, most influential Arab regional player. And the kingdom has to adapt to that. So it was not a political decision to do so. It was just overnight that Saudi Arabia is now in the forefront and has to deal with the new situation when it comes to shaping regional policy. And on the other hand, Saudi Arabia is facing tremendous domestic challenges in terms of socio-economic obstacles, in terms of youth unemployment, in terms of what might be the main pillar of the relationship between society and state. What will be the new social contracts? And MBS wants to deal with those two main challenges in different terms. So the first of all is centralization of his power. So the horizontal approach to power struggle has become vertical, implicating the concentration of power to a very small circle. And we all have witnessed the wave of arrests in November 2017 when he accused influential traditional players from the royal family, from business, and arrested them in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Riyadh. And of course, we also have in mind the brutal killing of Jamal Khashoggi in October last year. So the next main pillar of his politics is mobilizing the youth. So he presents himself as the mouthpiece of a new and a young Saudi generation. We have to take into consideration that 70% of the Saudi population is under the age of 30, and of course MBS is part of this generation, as he's very young, with 33 years old. In this regard, he is denouncing disloyal players as traitors. So the Saudi leadership wants to establish a new type of nationalism based on absolute loyalty to MBS. If anyone anyone does not show this loyalty towards MBS, he has become an outsider and he's become a traitor of the national unity. We can see it, of course, again in the case of Khashoggi, and also in the detention of female activists who have been promoting the lift of driving ban for women. And last but not least, and this brings me to the regional approach of Saudi Arabia, is the demonization of external enemies such as Qatar and Iran. So this anti-Iran approach, for instance, has become part and parcel of MBS' domestic strategy to create a new Saudi nationalism, to create a common enemy, to create a rally around the flag patriotism, in order, first of all, to fulfill his political will to concentrate power and to consolidate power, but second, also to divert attention away from socio-economic obstacles that I've mentioned so far. So this anti-Iranian approach is based on a threat perception that can be labeled as a Iranoia, as I would put it, that everything that goes in the wrong direction has been coming from Iran or from Iranian-sponsored allies around Saudi Arabia and neighboring countries such as Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and of course also in Lebanon. So he wants to present himself as the guardian of the Saudi nation who acts more consequent than Saudi leaders in the past. And this approach, which is directly linked to his domestic interest, has empowered a winner-takes-it-all mentality in the Saudi Arabian regional policy approach. So there is no sense for compromise, especially when it comes to Iran. So there is more a sense of we have to deal with our problems on ourselves. So we cannot really rely on traditional partners such as the United States, as was shown under the former President Barack Obama and the GCPOA. So we have to take the fate in our own hands, and we have tried to create ad hoc alliances, as we can see with Israel at the moment, in order to counterbalance the perceived rising Iranian influence in the region. So this kind of behavior, this threat perception puts, of course, fuel to the conflicts due to the fact because there is a lack of compromise in this regard. Nonetheless, and this will be my last point, when I'm frequently traveling to Saudi Arabia, my colleagues often refer to me that a direct military confrontation with Iran is not in the interest of Saudi Arabia. So they are looking for a solution, maybe also a face-saving solution, and we have also to take into consideration that the pressure on Saudi Arabia has become extremely high due to the social economic obstacles, due to the shattered reputation with regards to the military engagement in Yemen, and last but not least, due to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So maybe there might be a window of opportunity in the future that Saudi Arabia could return to a more traditional approach in order to mediate conflicts than to escalate conflicts. And one colleague of mine in Saudi Arabia put it in a quite good way, I would say, and I quote, "One of Saudi Arabia's tactics is driving with a great speed towards a cliff, but never jumping off." And I think this makes sense to some extent, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask a few questions. Broadly speaking, it seems common to all the countries that a lot of the changing approaches at the region are due to the threat perceptions and the geopolitical environment, as well as some of the domestic challenges each country face. This has manifested itself into support to a number of militias within the different conflict areas, and as Carsten mentioned, has mutated the conflict, fragmented it, and led to the breakdown of multilateral approaches. I wanted to ask actually about the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, and whether or not this features in the calculations of any of the different actors when they intervene, and if so, how do they apply it and how do they understand it? And I'd like to ask I'd hope each of you would have something to say about this.
Well, I think it's not my role to judge the form of, on the nature of interventions here. We are a mediating office. But I don't see R2P being a driving force. I think after Libya and the previous examples that are driving the interests of some of the parties who are dealing with Syria, especially also Russia, that after all these experiences, especially after Iraq and Libya, I think that when we have, at some point later on in history, a little bit of a distance to the Syrian conflict, we come probably to the conclusion that this conflict has changed not only a lot of political realities in the region, but also that parts of international law might have to be rewritten after the Syrian conflict. That's a very sobering statement, but I do think that this is some long-term impact of what we have seen in Syria, where so many red lines have been crossed that we would have never imagined to be crossed. Deliberate targeting of hospitals, of civilians, etc. And that is far away from what those discussions had in mind when R2P was at its heyday, I think, in 2005.
I think, interestingly, the responsibility to protect idea is in fact in the constitution of the Islamic Republic. Unlike what is claimed everywhere, it is nowhere to be found in the constitution that Iran wants to export its revolution. It's not in the constitution. But what you will find in the constitution, and this is what some people make of it, is that the Islamic Republic views as its obligation to protect the downtrodden or the mustadafin. And one could argue that this is the Iranian version of responsibility to protect, that when the Iraqi allies are under attack by Daesh. This is not necessarily a downtrodden government attacked by the extremist group, but this is when some sort of a sense of responsibility to protect jumps in. I think this theme of the downtrodden can be used on Ansarullah in Yemen, for example, that they see groups being attacked by Saudi Arabia. This is the Iranian narrative of it. I'm not saying whether this is the right one or the wrong one, but the Iranian narrative says we have a group which is attacked by a bigger power, and we are supposed to protect them. Same goes with the Palestinians and Israel. So there is this Iranian version of R2P, or the responsibility to protect, that certainly comes into play in some of the regional activities.
I think using a normative language is part and parcel of almost every actors in the Middle East and beyond, because no one would like to say my agenda is either sectarian or very driven by a very narrow interest or ethnocentric. But the defining nature is the following: who these regional actors want to protect, and who do they want to annihilate? And the stance on this tell us, where do they stand? For instance, look at the nature of the discourse when it comes to Yemen and Syria. In Turkey, the stance on Syria is very much couched in a normative language. But the Yemen is also suffering one of its worst humanitarian crises, but nevertheless the nature of the discussion on Yemen is almost non-existent. Or, when you approach the Saudi Arabia brutally suppressed the protesters in Bahrain. But most of the countries that supported the Arab uprisings was almost completely silent on the suppression of the protesters in Bahrain. So unfortunately, the language, the normative language, or the responsibility to protect value, or the normative aspect, is being utilized by everyone, because no one would like to tell you that they are there for narrow national interests or beat up the certain groups. But nevertheless, it has very little, of almost to some extent no value, when this principle is set against these preconceived national interests. Most of them sometimes comes across as quite regressive as well too. In Syria, Russia is also very much using a normative language for its presence in Syria. Iran is using a very normative language. Turkey is using a very normative language. But more or less, all these actors are there for very narrow national interests. And whenever the national interest and this normative consideration was in conflict, the normative consideration simply has no value in the policy-making process at all. A country is silent on Yemen, but very much normatively vocal on Syria. Bahrain, now Sudan. Who is talking about the protests in Sudan? It's a military government there. It's someone who came to power through coup.
Yeah, with regards to Saudi Arabia, I can fully agree with what Galip said about normative framing of regional engagement, and I think this is also true for Saudi Arabia when it comes specifically to Yemen. So, as the custodian of the two holy shrines, Saudi Arabia has the legitimacy and also the responsibility to act in a normative, or put it in the religious way, in order to protect people, Muslims. So this is it has always been part of the rhetoric, it has always been part of the propaganda, and now maybe it is framed in a more aggressive, confrontative way, but it's still there. So when we talk about, or when I discuss the Yemen issue with my Saudi colleagues, of course they are framing it as protecting people, Muslims who have been under threat from external powers or from the Houthis in this regard. And of course it has also been mentioned, and we have to take this into consideration, that Saudi Arabia is, cynically it sounds, a very important provider of humanitarian relief in Yemen. So this, of course, this is not part of our discussion for obvious reasons, but this is, when you are in Saudi Arabia and you try to to discuss, quite frankly, the negative outcomes of the military engagement of Saudi Arabia or of the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, there is always this argument, look, but we are trying to help those people. We are trying to provide them with humanitarian relief more than any other international donor is doing. And this is, from a statistical point of view, this is true. And it's also part of framing the narrative in a more humanitarian way. So I think what we in the West or in Europe, what is very difficult for us to understand is to differentiate between all those narratives, because every actor is arguing in one way or the other in the same direction. We are doing it for the good of the people. So I think the principle of responsibility to protect also gives to some extent those players a good argument and maybe also a facade to just frame their foreign politics in a way we could understand it, or they try to address us in a way they might think we can understand.
Thank you. We heard a little bit about what drives intervention at the regional level by each actor, but what do you think drives intervention by international actors, and how have regional actors leveraged that? To Adnan and Galip.
Well, I would assume it can really be explained with geopolitical interests. As Galip mentioned already, regional powers as well as extra-regional powers use a certain normative frame or narrative to justify what they do. Be it a democratic movement that they see in a certain country, or be it human rights or whatever. But obviously the same hypocrisy that we find in regional actors can also be found in extra-regional powers. And to me, maybe if you had asked me 2, 3, 4 years ago, I would have been a bit more positive about the role European countries thought they could play in the region. But at the moment, I think it really has to do with in the best case, economic interests, but usually it has more to do with security interests and trying to avoid further destabilization, which obviously is something that an interest that regional actors and people living in the region in fact share. But when it comes to the geopolitics of decisions, then obviously you have a lot of conflict, and that goes then back to what Galip mentioned as particular singular interests of all the actors.
I think we are, at the loss of some of the certainties when it comes to international powers' involvement within the region. Previously, we had some kind of framework within which we were operating. Particularly, there was the assumption that more or less the US and the European interests or values were seen as more in sync when it comes to the Middle East. Russia was seen from a different perspective, and therefore and all these countries engaged with different actors based on some of the certainties that we had. Particularly when it comes to European powers, the framework within which they have conducted their previous regional policy is no longer existent, which was a US-centric framework. Particularly, maybe since the Suez crisis, more or less the European powers has operated within a framework. They disagreed with the US. There was the areas of disagreement, but effectively the broader framework within which the European operated inter-region was very US-centric. But right now, most of the US policy is directly in contravention of the European interest. The US stands on the nuclear file. The US stands on the moving of the capital to Jerusalem. The US haphazard withdrawal or the idea of withdrawal from Syria. So most of the US policy is either quite shaky or not very well framed or not very well thought through, or it's directly in contrast with the European interest. And that requires Europe to come up with some policies, some other sensible policies. Unfortunately, Europe, instead of coming with some policies, it comes either with some reactions as we've seen within the context of the refugee crisis and then radicalism. So it just reacts, and then therefore, sign some of the agreements with neighboring countries, and then, think that the problem just went away, or be incorporated into someone else's game plan, as we saw the German and the French presence in Istanbul for the Astana trio meetings. And effectively, I see more and more some of the European powers will be incorporated to the Astana framework, or still, in one way or another, follow the US undefinable policy choices as well too. I think unless and until Europe comes up with some policies, some sensible policies, the European both impacts and interests will be quite negligible in the region frameworks. When it comes to Russia, I mean, the Russian policies, as everyone says, one of the criticisms that Russia does not have special relationship with anyone. Maybe with Assad regime, but this is also questionable. One thing that Russia doesn't have special relationship in the region. Secondly, Russia does not have, in a sense, most of the Russian policy is quite short-termist as well too. That can be seen as the negative side. But on the positive side, or on the, for the Russia comes in a very focused way. The Russia focuses on Eastern Mediterranean. When you look at the activism of the Russian policy, Syria, Libya, good relation with Egypt, etc. There is very recognizable geographic space for Russian policy. Secondly, Russia utilizes this, instrumentalizes this for other purposes. Since 2015 to today, Middle East has come to become the largest market for Russian arms export. It's more than 50% of the Russian arms now go to the Middle East as well too. The Russia, as a result of its activism now, it engages in a much better way the price coordination, the energy price coordination with the Arab members of the OPEC. The Russia is engaging in other areas as well too. So the Russia seems to be quite a focused engagement with the region. But nevertheless, it's too early to judge the Russian moment, and particularly the Middle East does not provide a good context for stable hegemonies. So in this regard, I will be very skeptical about whatever we talk about the Russian ascendancy in the region. So we don't know whether this is a snapshot of a certain moment or is it the new reality. But in my judgment, the only reality in the Middle East is there is no reality. Whatever we frame as reality is just certain snapshot of certain moments, and it cannot be turned into a long-running structural picture of the new era.
So what do you think, Carsten and Sebastian, this tells us about being able to affect the strategic calculus of each player? If everything is driven, one, by short-termism, national interests, and increasing bilateralization.
Well, that's what I tried to say before. It's one of the challenges that we are working on, crumbling scenarios. But I also think that there is a chance in bilateralism when you have suddenly, as I said, a U-turn, or you have new alliances that you can use in order to stimulate support for the political process. Also to define, despite the rather narrow national interests, still the interest in a political solution, in an international solution. I think it is still there mostly, but it is not something that is high in the priority when you compare it to other national interests. But still, there it is. I think very often in the diplomatic talking points, etc., people refer to Geneva. So if it wasn't there, you would need to create it as a projection platform of something. It also is always the question: when does it coincide suddenly that you need it? It coincides with other events that you need it. We had a lot of international events that have damaged Geneva. For example, I remember in the Brahimi times, it was the Ukraine crisis that had nothing to do with Syria and had a big effect on us because the US and Russia were not talking to each other any longer, and much less about Syria. But in turn, it can also happen suddenly that an external effect comes in and is a driving force for a political solution. So therefore, I think it is not easy to have a fragmented bilateral environment, but I think the challenge is to use these different approaches and loose ends perhaps we will see, or hopefully we will find a way how to coordinate better. That's also what Geir Petersen, the envoy, said in New York in his Security Council briefing, to coordinate and stimulate the international support for the peace process again. And I think that is something that we are working on as well.
I think when we again look to Saudi Arabia, they have to, as I said, they have to adapt to a very new situation. So traditionally they were very closely linked to the United States, and the era of Barack Obama led to a sentiment in Saudi Arabia that they have to rely on their own, that they have to act independently, because Barack Obama was not that supportive as maybe former presidents in the past. So this is on an international level. This is to some extent quite new for Saudi Arabia to find their own way. Although Donald Trump is quite cooperative when it comes to Saudi Arabia and is on its side, but on the other hand, this also has encouraged Saudi Arabia to act more assertive on a regional level, especially when it comes to the Qatar crisis, for instance. So this brings me to the second level, which is more a local one, and which is maybe also a generational one. So what we see in the Gulf, especially in the Gulf states, is a new generation of rulers. It's they have to gain and to win reputation from their populations, because they have not the seniority and they have not the respect as the old dinosaurs who that have ruled the country over decades. So I think the Emir of Qatar and of course MBS are very good examples for that they have to find a way to win the heart and minds of their people. Therefore they have to do something different, and in order to do something different, they act more harshly, they act more confrontative as maybe other leaders in the past, because they think they need to do so. And I think this, combined with the situation that there is a vacuum of international influence on the region, that the sheriff of the United States is to some extent leaving the region, and that the European Union, maybe as a former role model of multilateralism, is very fragile and is dealing with itself, Brexit, etc. Also puts those regimes under pressure to find their own way, and I think this also creates opportunities. At the moment, it seems extremely negative, and maybe sometimes it is a conflict of egos. It is also a generational conflict that has been occurred in all those societies. But in the foreseeable future, bilateralism gives a chance also to look for common ground and common interests, and it's always quite fascinating when I'm listening to Adnan and to other experts talking about Iran, how many things Saudi Arabia and Iran has in common, and economically, socially, with regards to security interests, and of course this might provide windows of opportunities in the future. But as we said, at the moment, it is a period of threat perceptions in order to consolidate personal, individual political power, and it's also an era of narratives and of normative narratives, and therefore there is a limited space for rapprochement or for reconciliation between rivals. But at the end, other interests are more existential for those countries, such as environmental issues, such as economic challenges, how to absorb our young generations into the job market, and Iran and Saudi Arabia are still facing those challenges, and I think both of them could learn from each other. So therefore, there is, to be a little bit more optimistic, there is some hope for the future that this could also lead to a more pragmatic, a more rational approach, and bilateralism could play a role in that.
Thanks. I'd like to move now talking from the regional level to actually how this has affected and impacted conflict in the region, in places like Syria and Yemen, and the effects it's had on ordinary people. Carsten, how did the piecemeal intervention in Syria actually prolong the conflict? Some weapons, but nothing decisive, and so forth.
How the interventions prolonged the conflict? Well, I mean, it's obvious that whenever there is a conflict, and you have, a proxy war situation, it's getting more difficult to solve it, because you have to include more actors, you have to include more agendas, and trying to, as I said, trying to come back what I said before, one of the challenges of a political process is to involve those actors who have those different interests, or maybe very similar interests, for different reasons, in order to come up to at least to come to some conclusions and common ground on that crisis. We have seen that before, as it was possible. By the way, also there is a driving element in external developments. The interesting thing that's often forgotten is that the nuclear agreement with Iran, the JCPOA, was the decisive factor in 2015 that led to an inclusion of Iran in the Syrian support structure of the Syrian crisis with the ISSG. The ISSG was able to be formed because suddenly it was possible to get the US and Iran into the same room. And this then triggered the Geneva talks in January 2016. So end of 15 in Vienna, the ISSG came together. And I remember it was always the opinion of Brahimi too, that it was a big mistake that we, in that case, 2014, could not include Iran in that support structure. Now, the JCPOA made it possible, and it is precisely the cancellation of the JCPOA last year, from the US side at least, that made it difficult again to bring the same actors together. And that kind of contributes to the fragmentation of the international support geography. So you see how these external things play in, positively and negatively. And but that's a challenge, and I hope that despite the cancellation of the JCPOA from the American side, it will be possible to bridge those actors again in the near future.
Thanks. And can the three of you say a little bit about the differences and similarities between in Yemen and Syria between the interests of regional actors?
I would, if I may start, gentlemen, I would assume that there is an asymmetry in the case of Yemen with regards to the interests of Saudi Arabia, UAE on the one side and Iran on the other. For Iran, it's an opportunity to exert pressure on Saudi Arabia, to use that in other regional files. And one thing that we really have to take into consideration is that every single context is not seen as a context in itself, but with its interlinkage to all the other conflicts that are going on. So Iran might not have had any interest to exert pressure on Saudi Arabia if the Syria file didn't exist, if the Iraq file or Afghanistan file didn't exist. So in every context, you have a country which has borders to the context of conflict. In that case, it's obviously Saudi Arabia with regards to Yemen. For Iran, that has no borders to Syria. However, being able to reach Hezbollah in the south of this country through Syria is existential in its geopolitical posture, which raises the stakes for Iran in Syria. And I think that all these countries are realizing, even if it's not publicly discussed, that they're reaching their limits with regards to how much they can invest both in financial and military terms in the different contexts. And as I said again, and Carsten pointed that out, it's getting increasingly difficult to include all the different interests of the particular actors in each and every single context. But I would assume if, for example, Iranians and Saudis talked about Yemen while at the same time speaking about Afghanistan, then you would have a similar setting in which the Iranians are saying Afghanistan is our backyard, Yemen is your backyard, do what you can to protect our borders to Afghanistan, we may help you to protect your borders to Yemen. I'm just thinking out loud here. This must be the only way forward. Otherwise, I don't see how they can work together to scale down the conflicts.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Yemen is a special case for Saudi Arabia. As Adnan mentioned, it's perceived as the backyard, and the conflict in Yemen, or the conflicts in Yemen over the decades, has also been estimated as and assessed as an internal conflict, not as an issue of external or regional politics. So Yemen is extremely special, extremely sensitive for Saudi Arabia due to security reasons, due to cross-border, transnational, transcultural connections between groups of people, between tribes, etc., etc. So therefore, the emotional impact of the developments in Yemen cannot be underestimated when it comes to the discussion inside Saudi Arabia. What Saudi Arabia tried to do in the past is to keep Yemen as strong as necessary and as weak as possible. This policy or this approach of balancing powers inside Yemen was destroyed when the Houthis took over Sana'a. And in this regard, Saudi Arabia decided we have to act in order to rebuild our influence and to rebuild this very fragile balance of powers inside Yemen. And this is what they are trying to do at the moment with obvious the wrong instruments, and they are not capable in order to solve these issues because they have lost over time networks and influential players on the Yemeni side they could co-opt and they could cooperate with. So now they are bombing the country, they are flying airstrikes, the international reputation has been shattered. Saudi Arabia has, and other allies, has been accused of committing crimes against humanity, etc. And this is perceived in Saudi Arabia with a complete lack of understanding, because they see themselves in the right position when it comes to Yemen, because they only want to defend themselves from a direct threat caused by the Houthis and from an indirect threat coming from Iran. So this is the narrative in Saudi Arabia, and therefore I think this asymmetric interests that Iran has nothing to lose and only to win in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia is quite the opposite, makes it extremely difficult for Saudi Arabia to take a step back, to sit at one table also with the Iranians, because it's not acceptable. It's from an existential point of view not acceptable for Saudi Arabia that Iran could have a stake into Yemen. Adnan, you mentioned Afghanistan, and I think there are other regional theaters where it could be more productive for both countries to communicate and to coordinate with each other, just to discuss those issues. Maybe Iraq could be one of those scenarios. Maybe there are others where Saudi Arabia and Iran could find a common solution how to share power, to bring back this principle of power sharing. But as I said in the beginning, I think at the moment the time is not ripe for that.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to the floor now for any questions. I'll take them in groups of 3, please. Please wait till the microphone comes.
Hello, I am Marlene, I'm a journalist. My first question to Adnan, I would like to, if you can describe to us the future role of Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon, especially after all this American pressure on Hezbollah and on Iran. My second question is to Sebastian. How do you explain why the Saudi Arabia is hesitating to reopen its embassy in Syria, even though UAE and Bahrain opened their embassies there? And I know it's a little bit local, but also I don't know if you have any explanation on why Saudi Arabia becomes more easy with Lebanon. Its openness recently is very obvious, especially they lift the embargo on the tourism. How do you explain that? Thank you.
I will continue a little bit the question about reopening the embassies of Emirates and Bahrain in Syria. And many people said that it couldn't be done without the green light coming from Saudi Arabia. Now the question is why this change of attitude from Riyadh and from the Gulf countries? And there were many opinions. One was that the Gulf countries don't want to see the fate of an Arab country like Syria decided by non-Arab countries in Astana platform. The second is the threat perceived from Iran, the extending influence of Iran in Syria. And the third one, and I come here to my question, the third one will be the threat from Turkey, and especially the support of Turkey for Muslim Brotherhood. How real is this threat coming from Muslim Brotherhood for the Gulf countries and for Syria? And what's the level of the support of Turkey for Muslim Brotherhood? Thank you.
Yes, hello, good morning. My name is Emil Issa, I'm a communications consultant. My question is for Mr. Sons concerning the role possibly of going beyond the Middle East, and maybe today we've seen Pakistan as a destination where MBS has recently been there, and there have been a few declarations between India and Iran. Do you think there could be a spillover also of this tension outside the Middle East and going a bit beyond? Thank you.
Shall we start with this first round? So the role of Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon, Saudi's hesitation on the US Embassy, the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood, and potential spillover beyond the region. Perhaps we can start with Adnan.
Thank you for your question, and allow me to also invite Carsten to speak a bit about Hezbollah in Syria, as I'm not too knowledgeable on that. And in general, my assessment would be, because you asked about this in the light of renewed US sanctions, and I think it's an important point you made, and I should have made that earlier myself, that these groups that Iran work with, look at the Hashid in Iraq, that are now also in parliament, they are part of the state. Many of the groups Iran work with are not just non-state actors, they are hybrid actors. They're both state and non-state, if you will. And them being in state, for example, the Hashid in Iraq or Hezbollah here in Lebanon, are part of the political class, are part of the political establishment, and can also be, if they are willing to, a political interest group that furthers and supports Iranian interests. As armed groups with possibilities, infrastructure, and certain infrastructure on the ground, they might also be helpful for Iran to circumvent sanctions in one way or another. And I never looked into that deeply enough to think about how they do it, whether they drive with suitcases full of money from one border to the other. That's like the cliche-like view you may have of how they can support Iran. But I think taking into consideration that US pressure is increasing, supported by regional allies, these hybrid actors, and that goes beyond Hezbollah, can be very important for Iran to basically survive economically and politically in the region. And yeah, maybe Carsten, if you want to add something on Syria. No, sorry.
Galip, do you want to say something about the threat of the
Sure.
Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, thank you. I mean, in Saudi Arabia and UAE, I'm not sure whether they are fighting a political threat or a popular trend, because what it comes across these countries are fighting against a popular threat more than a political threat. I'm not sure what is the number of the Muslim Brotherhood and in UAE, but if I know anything about it, it seems to be like, within the range of hundreds. But you have the UAE spending tens of billions of dollars from Egypt to Libya, from Qatari crisis to many other spots of the region. And there, one of the idea is that it's fighting the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, it does fight Muslim Brotherhood, but specifically what I think is more than the Muslim Brotherhood is one component. But it is not the threat of Muslim Brotherhood. It is a popular trend that they are fighting. And that's why, in Tunisia, they were trying to engineer a coup as well too. So right now, I think the new groupings that you see in the region is very much, you see the contest of the vision for a new regional order in that. This was what started with the Arab uprisings. Increasingly, the divergence between the places like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, and Qatar took place. It was basically the different stance on Arab Spring, and the Muslim Brotherhood was an extension of this Arab uprising. The stance on Muslim Brotherhood was an extension of the stance on the Arab uprising in general itself as well too. So in this regard, the Saudi Arabia and UAE seems to me mostly fighting against a political psychology and a popular trend rather than just reducing this issue to Muslim Brotherhood. And Turkey does support the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, that's quite obvious. Turkey does support the political Islam, but I think the Turkish support goes beyond it. I mean, in Iraq, in 2010, Turkey was strongly supported the Iraqi list, which was neither Islamist nor actually a secular Shia was the lead in the Iraqi list. So Iraqi list very much was an Ankara initiative more than an Iraqi initiative to some extent. So in this regard, yes, Turkey does support the political Islamic movements, but Turkey its support did go beyond it as well too. But in the case of Saudi Arabia and UAE particularly, I think the focus is they're mostly fighting against a popular trend rather than specific threats.
Just to continue what Galip said about the Muslim Brotherhood, from my point of view, the toppling of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was a watershed when it comes to fighting or competing with political Islam. So Saudi Arabia was concerned about a spillover effect from Egypt to the Gulf monarchies, that there might be emerging a democratic, Islamist democratic alternative which might compete with the monarchies in the Gulf. So this is one reason, but I think we also have to differentiate a little bit between Saudi Arabia and the UAE when it comes to the position against or to the Muslim Brotherhood. From a Saudi point of view, Iran and Iranoia is much more important than Ikhwanoia, to put it this way. So it is they are able to act in a quite pragmatic way with Islamist groups, for instance in Yemen, and they have no issue at all with Ennahda in Tunisia, for instance. So it is more, and there are some reasons for that. It is more on the UAE to counterbalance the Muslim Brotherhood in the region, and I think the driving force behind that argument that Qatar is promoting Muslim Brotherhood was not initiated by Saudi Arabia, it was mostly initiated by the UAE, but of course we can discuss that. Let me answer the question on Pakistan, which is of course very interesting and I think very important and often extremely ignored, I would say. So I did research on especially this topic during my PhD, and when you are in Pakistan, of course, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia is described as a proxy war that also takes place inside Pakistan on different levels, politically, economically, culturally, and it is much more sensitive for Pakistan due to their Shiite population, significant significant Shiite population due to their direct borders with Iran, and of course due to their very close and ambivalent relationship with Saudi Arabia on the military level, but especially when it comes to Saudi Arabia as the most important destination country for labor migrants coming from Pakistan, and that without remittances from Saudi Arabia, the Pakistani economy would not be able to survive. So therefore, for the Pakistani government, but also for the public, for whatever civil society, for economy, it is extremely sensitive to balance the relationship between both countries. And therefore, you mentioned the visit of MBS in Pakistan and how we was welcomed by Imran Khan, etc. This shows the traditional position of the Pakistani governments over decades, that starting in the 1970s, I would say, that Saudi Arabia will be a traditional partner for the reasons I've mentioned, but on the other hand, they also have to look how to deal with Iran, and I think this is it's an extremely difficult situation for Pakistan because they have no support from neither side, and they feel extremely weak to counter this proxy war inside their country. Why is Saudi Arabia hesitant to reopening its embassy in Syria? I think it's not the top priority of Saudi Arabia's regional policy at the moment. Syria is not a top priority and has not been a top priority in recent years. So therefore, maybe it's a wait-and-see strategy to look how it goes for the UAE and other smaller Gulf countries if they have to deal with the backlash coming from the international community that 2 years ago they were against Bashar al-Assad. Now they're trying to work together with them again. This might be one explanation. Maybe it's not the accurate one, but I find it quite logical. And with regards to Lebanon, I think the Hariri affair, if I could put it this way, of course, has put a lot of pressure also on MBS with regards to his reputation, and that maybe he tried to calm down the situation a little bit and wants to rebuild trust in Saudi Arabia as a very important partner of Lebanon in a good and a bad way. So if there is a strategy behind it, I'm not sure about it. I also would say at the moment Yemen is a top priority, so mostly all of the capacities in military and political senses are focusing on Yemen. Then maybe Qatar comes second. Lebanon and Syria, from my point of view, are not as interesting as the others. It is important, but I think the Saudis have realized that they are in a much weaker position when it comes to Lebanon and Syria with regards to Iran, and therefore they are trying to concentrate their limited capacities on regional arenas where they can really have an impact and where they can really counterbalance Iranian influence. And this is Yemen and maybe also some others, and Pakistan could also be one of those theaters, but I think they have realized they have lost ground in Syria and Lebanon in recent years.
Maybe there's one other reason why the embassies are not opened yet, and if you listen to the Egyptian foreign minister, who clearly linked this decision to the political process in Geneva, which was an interesting statement, saying that the normalization process will only take place when and if the government in Damascus is cooperating in Constitution Committee and other things in Geneva. And that is, of course, one of these factors that also play a role in Saudi Arabia then.
I'll take another 4 questions. I'll go start on this side. Please.
مرحبا شكرا لكم.
Good morning, thank you. I have a question to Mr. Sebastian regarding the Arab Alliance. This Arab Alliance has come to Yemen in order to recover and restore its legitimacy. And now it is exerting its control over 75% of the Yemeni territories. Why can't the legitimate government be formed again in order to restore its control over the territories of Yemen?
صباح الخير.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you all. And my question is addressed to all the panelists, actually. What is the role of the great powers in implementing the Middle East plan, which is based on fragmenting the region on the basis of ethnic and confessional lines in order to create some confession-based small states? My other question is, who was present in Ankara summit? What were the states that have attended Ankara summit, and who really has requested Putin to interfere in Syria in order to fight corruption and to fight terrorism? At that time, we can clearly see that Iran was collapsed and the regime was collapsed. So they were kind of defeated in the field, in the Syrian context at that time. So why was Russia called to interfere in order to fight terrorism? And what is the concept of terrorism for those states, for those large states, medium-sized states, and others? How do they understand terrorism? Thank you.
From Carnegie. Thank you for your presentations, but I would like to come back a little bit to the theme of, to the issue that is our conference here, power sharing. Maybe asking Adnan and Galip, from Turkey's and Iran's point of view, if there's a Syrian solution of the kind that we discussed during the whole 2 days here, what would be the two countries' vision and, let's say, minimum acceptable in terms of power sharing agreement in Syria? What are the, let's say, the minimum requirements of both countries, and what are the red lines that they won't accept in terms of power sharing from each capital's point of view? Thank you.
Thank you. My question was triggered by Sebastian's comment about openings. And I wonder to what extent there is sort of regionalism as a way of thinking about the issues in the region. Has regionalism entered the political sort of imagination? And two things throughout this conference have sort of pushed me to think more about this. One is that a lot of what we've heard about the sort of violent conflicts in the region, a lot of them seem to be intractable in the framework of the nation state. There is something about the zero-sum logic within the nation state, both the armed groups and their regional and international patrons, that sort of militates against sustainable resolution of these conflicts. And in another region where war was pervasive, in the context of nation state, Europe, that eventually, created an opening for regionalism and for balancing the logic of the nation state with sort of the logic of regionalism. And the other thing that also pushed me in that direction is, and that's the difference with the classic nation states of Europe. The classic nation states were sort of built through war. There is sort of Charles Tilly's famous dictum that the state made war and war made the state. But current wars are actually state unbuilding. There is something about contemporary wars, and we can talk more about why, but they are fundamentally state unbuilding rather than state building. And I think the combination of these two elements, sort of the intractable character of conflict, but also its inherently state unbuilding logic in a sort of global context in the current moment that we live, makes me wonder whether sort of regionalism has entered thinking, intellectual thinking, political imaginaries in the region.
Good morning. Thank you, panelists. I have a few questions. First of all, we've heard talking of many countries that are taking part in all of these conflicts, but we have also heard the term of militia. So, as we can see that most probably and very obviously, sorry, the militias or the armed parties are the ones who are actually doing the war and who are actually doing the conflict. So first of all, my first question is what to become of these parties that we are now calling militias? I mean, when the war is over, are they gonna stay militias? We know that countries that have wealth are taking advantage of the presence of these parties and these groups in order to let the conflict move forward or sometimes backwards. So what would be the destiny of such groups? Would they become the actual authority when the conflict is over, or they would be just a simple tool that only appeared during the conflict and then it will disappear? So this is my first part of the question. The second part is regarding all the timeline of the conflict that happened in the regions, more specifically in Yemen and in Iraq. Maybe the most dangerous weapon that was used during these wars and this conflict was media. Media, and specifically social media, was really important during these conflicts. We have seen a lot of rumors, and some of them turned to be a truth. Some others are still mysteries that we don't know if whether these are facts that actually happened or not. Here, just a very innocent question. We've heard a very objective and analytical approach from you. Why don't we see this type of talks, especially from Western media? Why? I mean, like, example about Yemen. The title is always "The Crisis in Yemen" or "The War in Yemen," the war against Houthis. Now we've heard a more important and a more impactful term, which is the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. We've never heard this in a lot of on a lot of media platforms. So this is just it, and thank you so much.
Okay, I believe we have 6 questions. Yes. Okay, so shall we ask her to ask it again? I now have translation.
What is the role of great powers in implementing the fragmentation project of the Middle East? And this is what they call the Middle East project of fragmentation and division, because they have started diffusing some sectarian and confessional problems in order to create some confessional and sectarian substates that are clashing between each other. We often refer to Ankara talks in order to talk about the interference of Russia and the role of Russia in the region. Actually, in 2015, we had Ankara summit. We have seen Ankara summit being held. What were the states that have attended and that have taken part in Ankara summit in 2015? And why did those states request Russia to interfere in Syria in order to fight terrorism? What terrorism are we talking about? If we take into consideration Iran and the regime, if they were really considered as terrorists, they were already collapsed. They weren't really the victors. They have already been defeated at that time. Therefore, about what terrorism we are talking about in Ankara in order to request the interference of Russia to fight terrorism, and why haven't they embarked on such a fight against terrorism with Russia? Thank you. My question is to Dr. Sebastian. We have seen that the Arab Alliance has come to Yemen in order to restore the legitimacy to the government of Yemen. Today, after 4 years, it has controlled almost 80% of the territories of Yemen. Therefore, why isn't the legitimate government allowed to fulfill its legitimate role in the different areas such as Adnan and other areas of Yemen? Thank you.
I'm going to quickly repeat all 6 questions. First, the Arab Alliance has now come to Yemen to restore the legitimacy of Yemeni government. Why haven't we seen it be able to fill its legitimate role in other contexts like Aden within Yemen? Secondly, the second question was on the role of great powers and how it's engaged in the implementation of the fragmentation project of the Middle East in order to create further breakdown of states into smaller and smaller communities that are based on confessional or sectarian groupings. At the Ankara summit that was held in 2015, who attended and why did those states request Russia interference? And how, in terms of Russia interference to help deal with terrorism, and what type of terrorism are we talking about? The other questions is bringing it back to the topic. If we look at the Syrian solution, what is the vision and the framework of the 2 countries on Syria? Is there potential for compromise? Lastly, is the potential of regionalism an opportunity of dealing with both local and regional conflicts? Yes, and then on the question on militias and the future of non-armed groups. Okay, wonderful. Whoever would like to start with any or all of these questions.
I would just simply pick up the question on militias and the state, or the state of Syria after any agreement. Of course, it depends on, first of all, if there is a political agreement, if it will be an internationally brokered political solution, or if it will be a merely military solution, and then that would also, of course, have an influence on the importance of militias staying on the ground. On the other hand, it is also part of the discussion in a comprehensive agreement. We have, as you remember in Geneva, the 4 baskets that break down the UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which is the basis of our work. And basket number 4 deals with security issues, and it will have to be dealt with. Like in all other conflicts, the question, the challenges of demobilization, in Syria in particular, the challenge of educating the young fighters. You know that we have half a generation at least that is without education, that has, I've talked about Colombia. You have generations who have learned nothing else than shooting. That's the big challenge. Also, education is the challenge in order to prevent those people being an easy prey for extremism. So we're talking about the challenges beyond a peace agreement. Extremism and fundamentalism will continue as a challenge in the region. And the question is, where do they fall on fertile ground? And I think another variable that will have an influence on this issue is, will Iran or will Russia be the stronger power of influence after a peace agreement, since the approaches of the 2 countries are very different. Russia has approached the Syrian issue on 3 levels: militarily, politically, and diplomatically. And within its engagement with the Syrian government in Damascus, it has focused very much on state institutions, has tried to reintegrate militias into the Syrian army, etc. While Iran's approach is much more the opposite, is working with militias in order to counterbalance others. And so the question will be how much of, I don't think that militias will take, or that was one of the implications of your question, I don't think that militias will take over in any scenario after the war is over, kind of over. But I do think that they might play still a role. And the question is, how strong will be the Syrian army and the Syrian state institutions versus the newly created actors on the ground. But in any case, I hope that we still have the chance to talk about the leaving of or the all kind of conditions, how foreign forces will be leaving Syria in a political process in Geneva.
Okay, thank you for all your questions. Joe, your question on Iran and Syria, I would assume that the first thing that Iran insists on is the territorial integrity. That's at least what you take from the statements that come. If you had asked me 2 years ago, I would have said that Iran wants a pro-Tehran government in Damascus. Now I would, in the recent discussions that I have been hearing there, if it's not a pro-other country government, it may end up being a neutral government, also in the Iranian view. But this is a new trend, and I can't really say whether this is now the dominant view, but you can increasingly hear that if others see Damascus as being neutral and not pro-Saudi or pro-US, then Iran could live with a neutral Syrian government. And I want to recall what you said yesterday, which was a very important point, that sometimes actors realize that to be powerful means to be willing to share power with others. And this comes to the point that Carsten just made. If Iran wants to keep its influence in Syria, and that means to somehow be closer to the Russian approach, which was just outlined, I would assume that Iran would walk that way. A very short remark on the role of social media. I just want to make the point that we are speaking, in our region, we're speaking about countries with very, very unhealthy media landscapes, state-run media, etc. And in such an environment, social media are adding to the problem rather than being the remedy to it, I would say. You have a lot of fake content that goes around and nobody is controlling it. The question of regional fragmentation, I'm not really sure I understood the question, to be honest, properly, but I think that in fact all of the countries that are involved, at least from what I learn, is that none of them seek a new borders, and that they all ultimately they want the borders that exist to be stabilized, and then obviously the fragmentation that they have helped creating through militias, through proxy forces, is something that will be their main task, to basically bring those groups back. And it might be easier with some. Look at Hashd Shabi in Iraq, and will be more difficult with others if the nationality of the militias is not that of the country they're active in.
Well, let me start also with question of Joseph. Discursively, Turkey has been emphasizing territorial integrity and the sovereignty. But in reality, right now, a very significant chunk of the Syria is directly governed by Turkey. In northwestern part of the country, or the Turkey allied groups. The question in general, Turkey actually has no problem with the power sharing. The question who shares the power is the problem. So if the power sharing takes place between the general Syrian opposition and the Assad, is the solution that Turkey will be pushing for. But the question is, what will the Kurds get, what piece of the pie that the Kurds will get. So I think right now there is a paradoxical situation in which, on one hand, you effectively are on the ground and governing one part of the Syria. On the other hand, you are saying that, while the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of the Syria must be respected. I think two questions. A, would you recognize the central government of Syria, Assad regime? Because then, if the sovereignty is the question, who is the sovereign, where the sovereignty lies? In my judgment, a personal judgment, we should not normalize the Assad. In no condition that Assad should be normalized, but that's beside the point. The trouble that in Turkey, the acceptable solution will be any solution in which the role of the Kurds will be either non-existent or very significantly limited or diluted, will be acceptable to Turkey. As I said, right now, discursively, it's sovereignty, territorial integrity, but in practice, a chunk of the Syria is directly run by Turkey-allied groups. So that's the question, is not like power sharing, who will share the power is the real question. When it comes to the question, actually, I will bridge these two questions, the role of the great powers and then the role of the regionalism. This is like, an old debate. Why the Middle East does not have a regional order? Is it because of the nature and the feature of the international engagement, or is it because of the nature and the feature of the state? I am of the opinion that the Middle East does not have a regional order primarily because as a result of nature, feature of the regional, the states and the nature and feature of the regimes rather than the international engagement. For sure, most of the international engagement has been negative. It did contribute into the fragmentation of the region. But the reason that the region does not have it and will not have it anytime soon is because right now the state itself is problematic, the regime itself is problematic, the idea of legitimacy itself is problematic. So if you have anything, let's say you have a top level of regional order, what will be it? It will resemble an authoritarian international, and the main operating of this framework will be any change is bad and the people is the enemy. So if you have an order in the Middle East now with the current regimes, the structure of this order will be exactly like this. Authoritarian international, any change is bad, people are the enemy. So therefore right now, first, before the order, the nature and the structure of the domestic political order needs to be rethought and reshaped. Unless and until there is a new domestic political orders in many of these countries, Middle East is not going to have any regional order, and whatever order that will come is bad, is against the people, and is unhealthy and needs to be terminated at any level possible. So I would much rather a long-lasting catastrophe or the pang of change that will take maybe decades rather than this authoritarian structure that has delivered only misery. The last thing is on the question of the militias. It's clear what will happen. Some of them will be incorporated, some of them will be eliminated, some of them will be given some status. But the real debate is what are the criteria? Which is the criteria that we will use to incorporate or eliminate or give some status to this organization? Because in the end, all these non-state actors are seen by terrorists for some and as legitimate actors for others.
Okay, I try to make it quite brief. With regards to regionalism, I would advocate, of course, for bringing people from the region in touch with each other. I think not on a governmental level, but maybe on a civil society level, on an economic level, to make it as pragmatic as possible in order to discuss and to get in touch with each other. I think this is the only way all those narratives and emotionalized stereotypes of each other can be balanced or can be just reduced. And I think there are some quite good projects who wants to do so, and I think there's a lot of space for more engagement in this regard. And on the other hand, there are people who wants to do so. So of course you find Saudis and Iranians who are willing and enthusiastic about talking with each other, discussing with each other, sometimes differences, but also shared interest. With regard to social media, yes, what Adnan said is correct with regards to the region. Yemen, from my point of view, was a forgotten conflict in Western media, but this has changed to some extent, and the humanitarian implications of the Yemeni people has been addressed to some or less extent. So I think this is, as media goes, as media works, you have waves of attention, and especially when it comes to European media, you have other topics that are more prioritized. For instance, Brexit or whatever, the refugee crises, etc. But I think it's also lack of capacity. So if you do not have journalists on the ground that are able and expertise enough to travel the country, to travel to Yemen, maybe they do not get access, then it's extremely difficult to not replicate all all those narratives that have been created. I'm not exactly sure if I understood your question correctly. So with regards to Yemen and the regional fragmentation of Yemen and Aden, maybe just one or two sentences. Of course, we have different interests of members of the Saudi-led coalition. So we have the UAE who are trying to establish a foothold in the south of Yemen. That is, or the UAE is also cooperating with partners and allies that are not in favor of the Saudis and vice versa. So we have this, those interests that are not, or there are players not acting on the same side, and UAE and Saudi Arabia is often portrayed as one team. From my point of view, this is not true for the UAE because Saudi Arabia is more interested in, of course, security in the north of the country, whereas the United Arab Emirates are more interested in to enhance their economic and logistical impact in Yemen and in the wider and beyond, I would say. So in Africa as well, which is not in favor of what the Saudis are trying to do there. So maybe to put it this way. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate the fact that we've run over time by a good 10 to 15 minutes, and before we conclude, however, we'll have Maha and Nahim come up to speak. However, let's please join me in thanking our panelists for a very interesting and timely conversation.
Yeah, thank you all for your patience. We have run a bit over time, but it shows also, I think, the importance, relevance of the topic and the interest that it has generated even on the second day, which is rather more rare than often happening. I think our conference has not been an easy ride, and there are definitely no easy solutions inside. Nevertheless, Chris Halliday yesterday quoted his boss, Martin Griffiths, and said, "Hope is the currency of the mediator." And so I think we should also keep up the hope for ourselves. Let me mention a few brief elements. One key element mentioned first by Marina Ottaway was the distinction of power sharing between different political groups and power sharing between those who govern and the citizen. And I think even Marika mentioned today in the sense of Afghanistan that negotiations are often not inclusive and definitely not with civil society. Second key element introduced by Joseph Bahout yesterday was the difference between power sharing, addressing different groups, and democracy, addressing individuals. A third key element mentioned by Haris Hassan yesterday also was the distinction between power sharing and power allocation, and today we added another element which was the balancing of powers by Sebastian. One element that was mentioned by several of our panelists was the level of governance that we are talking about. Are we talking about a local governance and a local power sharing, or a national one? And as Jamila said yesterday, can traditional ways of power sharing on local levels work in times of regional interventions? Related to that was the question whether the case of Yemen is an example where it needs maybe an understanding of the regional powers, Turkey, Iran, Russia in the case of Syria, Iran and Qatar on the one hand side, Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia on the other side in the case of Yemen. One remark by Zahra Langi from Libya yesterday was, and I found it interesting, it raised the question of sequencing. Do we need nation building and state building before institution building, or should it be a parallel process? And that, of course, would need its own workshop. There were so many more quotes that I have taken with me and that I will be happy to quote in the coming months when I'm in discussions, starting from Joseph, who quoted Nadim Shehadi saying that Lebanon was the best of the failed states, to Marina, who insisted that you don't redesign the sprinkler system when the house is on fire, but rather call the fire brigade. Heiko Women suggested that the Syrian regime doesn't share but subcontracts power. And Saharlangi added on the resource curse that oil makes people dream and nations don't mature with oil. And the last one that I have noted was Sebastian, who was talking of Iranoia versus Ikhwanoia. So I think we have quite a few things that we can take home. We haven't found a solution for power sharing, definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution for the region, but I hope that we have all found many interesting elements that can bring our discussions further, because we will have to continue the struggle for a peaceful power sharing or whatever kind of sustainable governing system in the region. So that's from my side. Maha.
Thank you, Achim, and I want to thank everybody for joining us for the past 2 days for what has been really, I think, a tour de force of discussion on concepts of power sharing. They couldn't have come at a more opportune moment for this region, and I suspect this is a discussion we'll be having for quite some time to come, at least. I think some of them may be the key concepts or the key elements that came out for us from the last, in addition to the quotes, I think, the timely quotes that you mentioned, Achim, and the kind of lessons drawn that are embodied in these quotes. Maybe a couple of more things is that one, in terms of our region, there is no one model fits all. So power sharing really varies from one place to the other, what it means, how it is. Some of the lessons learned from power sharing experiences, perhaps, that are very relevant to the region is the idea of a victor's power sharing model, where the impacts of conflict, particularly on ethnic and sectarian repopulation or population engineering, are never reversed in the new power sharing models or in the new peace deals. And I think for a region such as ours, these are things we really need to be looking out for, because they only lay the ground for further instability, as we see from other examples. I think it was Bosnia where we saw that there's still a need for peacekeeping 30 years after the peace deal was struck. I think also that some of the key takeaways that we saw is, as you mentioned, the idea of the differences between power sharing that involves guarantees to specific individuals or specific groups, and rather the sense of mutual responsibility that different groups should have towards each other if we really want to have a positive power sharing model moving across the region. I won't go through the different lessons learned, including what Joseph mentioned and others, or the notion of what a resource curse, how resources can either be a blessing or a curse, and particularly when they're matched with a power sharing model, the kind of ills they can bring onto a society. Rather than the gains one can get out of it, a la Norway, for example, where they've turned their resources into a blessing in many ways. I think maybe one point that we should also remind ourselves is the role of regional, and we saw on this last panel where the role of regional actors, I mean, it was striking for me that we had several speakers, but most of them were either working on the files of these regions, so the Office of the Special Envoy for Yemen, the Special Envoy for Syria, someone from Iran, someone from Turkey. So the role of regional actors and international actors in carving out these power sharing models and what that implies for both their success and potential failures, I think is very important, and is nowhere is it more important than, again, in this region in particular, where regional actors do play a determining role and will play a determining role in what happens in both Syria and Lebanon, Lebanon they already are playing. They played it in 1990, but also in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, but also in Libya, to varying degrees. So I think, basically, in sum, I just want to thank everybody. I'd like to thank all the experts who joined us, the colleagues who came from very different parts of the world to join us. Thank Achim for this wonderful partnership with Friedrich-Ebert. I think it was a coming together of a shared values, but also shared kind of ideas and perspectives on what can be done and belief in wanting to do something for this region. And I'd like to thank you all for attending this conference, and we'll see you in our next edition. Thank you.